So we just took the quiz. Let's ask some questions about that measurement of happiness from Oprah's website. When we are talking about concepts, remember, we need to talk about validity, but there's another concept as well. It's called reliability. Reliability means not just that we're actually measuring what we claim to measure. That's validity. Reliability is if the construct doesn't change. So remember, in Oprah's, we were measuring the construct of happiness. So it looked like this. The construct, the circle, is happiness. The measurement was the happiness scale. Okay, so Oprah's happiness scale. Okay, that's what it looks like. If the construct, which is happiness, doesn't change, then the score that we got, remember the score that I got was an 80, then the score should be an 80 every time. That is reliability. Reliability means, does it consistently measure the same way? Is it reliably measuring the same way? Think about if you got on a scale, meaning like the scale of weight, right? So if you got on, at 10 a.m. and it says you weighed 150 pounds, and then you got on at 10:15 and it says you weighed 125 pounds, and then you got on at 10:45 and it says you weighed 165 pounds, and you got on at 11 o'clock and it says you weighed 120 pounds. Your weight didn't fluctuate that much within the hour, but you got different scores. That would not be a reliable scale. In the same way, we want to get the same score consistently as long as the construct doesn't change. If you get more happy, then we would want a happier score, right? We want a bigger score. But if you're not getting happier, then your score should stay exactly the same. One way that we do this is, so these are three different kinds of reliability that are important to us. Test, retest reliability. So in test, retest reliability, what we do is we test, and then at a different time we test it again. Now, assuming between those two times they stay the same, then we would have good test, retest reliability. So you get on the scale at 11, it says you're 125 pounds. You get on the scale at 12, it says you're 125 pounds. That's good reliability because your weight hasn't changed, right? You tested, then you retested. In the same way with happiness, let's assume you take the happiness scale on Thursday, you get an 80. You take the happiness scale again the next Thursday, and assuming your happiness hasn't changed, you get an 80 again. That's good retest reliability. Inter-rater reliability is when an observational measure is being used. In inter-rater reliability, what happens is you have different raters testing this. So for example, let's say that we were talking about a happiness measure by watching somebody else. So let's say that we had 3 observers watching one person to see how happy this person is. And the way that they're going to do is they're going to give them a score. Let's say, I think observer 1 thinks that their happiness is an 8. Well, observer 2 thinks their happiness is an 8. And observer 3 thinks their happiness is a 4. That's not good inter-rater reliability, because observer 1 and 2, they had good inter-rater reliability, but number 3 over here thinks it's a 4. That's not good. If the actual conceptual variable of happiness in the person is the same, and at the same time they're watching them, then it has to be the same, then you would have good inter-rater reliability. Internal reliability is only for self-report measures. And what it's saying is that the questions inside of the measure should correlate with each other. So what that means, let me show you what that means. Let's not keep my notations. Let's go back to Oprah's quiz. So if I retake Oprah's test, I'll show you that she has, in this case, several items, right? So this is an item. Self, I know who I am and I like myself. And then the second one, relationships. My most important relationships get most of my attention, okay? Internal reliability means that your answer on item 1 here should correlate with your answer on item 2. That is, each one of these items, all 10 of them, should be measuring the same concept, and that concept is happiness. Now, what that means is that any one of these items should be correlated with any one of the other items, right? If I got a mostly true here, then I should get a mostly true here if it's all measuring the same construct, okay? If it's not, then that means that one of the items is just out there, right? So let's say that one of the items says, you know, do you have a lot of Instagram followers, right? And it turns out that people who are mostly happy, they say, no, not true. I don't have very many Instagram followers. Then that Instagram followers one, it's not correlating the same way, right? It doesn't have good internal reliability, internal to the measurement, which is called a scale in this case. Inside of that measurement, there's not good reliability inside of it. That one item, how many Instagram followers you have, is not reliable compared to the other ones. That is called internal reliability. And so when we look at internal reliability, the way that we measure that is not with a normal correlation, because what we actually want to do is not just correlate item 1 with item 2. We want to correlate item 1 with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and each of them with each other. In order to do that, we run something called Cronbach's alpha. Cronbach's alpha is a statistic that we run which will tell us overall what is the internal reliability, the internal correlation between all of those items. It's called the inner item correlation. All right, let's ask some questions then. Oprah's happiness test. What kind of results am I going to get? Okay, now if you're thinking about this, you realize that nominal and categorical are the same thing. Nominal and categorical are the same thing. And if you remember, I got an 80 out of that. Well, 80 would mean I'd have more happiness than somebody who got a 70, which is more happiness than a 60, etc. That means I'm getting at least ordinal data out of that, which means I'm getting quantitative data. Remember, quantitative or continuous, those are the same thing. And ordinal, interval, and ratio, together, all three of those are forms of quantitative data, or continuous data, whichever term you want to use. Those are quantitative data. FCQs, what do they result in? What kind of data? Well, again, nominal and categorical are the same, right? If there's any more or less going on, then it's got to be quantitative, because ordinal, interval, and ratio are all quantitative. So your FCQs give quantitative data. Let's talk specifically more about both self-report and observational measurements. We'll start with self-report. We're going to give just some more details about self-report compared to observational measures. When you have a self-report measure, normally what you do is you have several, you got to be careful here. Normally we talk about being a survey, right? Somebody gives you a survey. Well, a survey technically is multiple scales. And scales are made up of multiple items. So what does that mean? If you remember the Oprah scale, so let me go back to the Oprah happiness scale. Look, there are 10 questions here, but remember, we didn't call them questions because they don't end in a question mark. These are items. And all of these items, see, each of these is an item. Item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So these are 10 different items. Okay? And together they are measuring one thing, one concept, and that concept is happiness. This is a scale. It's a happiness scale that is formed with 10 items. A scale is multiple self-report items that measure the same concept. So let me say that again with the word in front of you right here. A scale is multiple self-report items that measure the same concept. And when you have multiple scales in the same packet, we call that a survey. Most of the time in this class, we're going to talk about scales. Scales are multiple self-report items that measure the same concept. Don't mix this up with a response scale, or what's also called a response format. So what do I mean? Go back to Oprah. All of these together, Item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All of those items make up the happiness scale. However, underneath each item, we have a response format or a response scale. From not true to very true, that's the response scale or the response format. Often we think about, oh, like on a scale from not true to very true. Don't say that, because the scale is all the items that measure the same concept, right? All 10 of these items measure happiness. That makes up the scale. The response scale or the response format, that's the not true to very true. Okay? Don't mix those up. Don't mix those up. The scale, multiple self-report items that measure the same construct, and the response scale is underneath each item how you respond. For example, on a scale from 1 to 10, or not true to very true. Those are the response scales or the response format. It's different. Different self-report scales or items can be different, right? So the response formats can look quite different. They can be open-ended or forced choice. So open-ended just is a fill in the blank. So if I say, how are your relationships? And I just leave a blank and you respond, that's open-ended. Forced choice is much more likely. The Oprah scale that we just saw was a forced choice scale. Two common formats, response formats for forced choice scales, for forced choice items is what we should say, are Likert or semantic differential. So let's start with Likert. We normally say Likert. In reality, the guy's name was Likert. So if you say Likert, you're technically more correct and you can feel cool about yourself, I suppose. But almost everybody says Likert, a Likert type item. And Likert items are very, very, very common, and they look like this. A Likert item is one that has a statement. In this case, notice it's not a question. It's not, do you like onions? It's, I like onions. And then you have a form of agreement, like strongly agree to strongly disagree. So anything that has a statement and then your agreement, that is a Likert item. Likert items are forced choice response formats for self-report items. A semantic differential is also a forced choice response format, but instead of a Likert item like this, it has a concept, onions, and then it has several different semantic differentials. So love and hate, those are on different ends of the semantic meaning of liking, right? Love to hate. So what you would do is you'd have, here's the concept, onions, and then do you love or hate them? And where are you in your love and hate? And then you'd also have good compared to bad, and stinky compared to smells great, right? Those are different semantic differentials. They differ in their semantic, in the semantic poles, the polarity of their semantics. Love is the opposite of hate. And then you would tell where you are on the semantic differential for that concept of onions. The pros and cons of open-ended versus closed forced choice. Open-ended versus forced choice. Open-ended, the pros are you get all sorts of rich data. You're not going to miss things. But the cons are you can't really aggregate those data very well and get a good quantitative measure out of it. It's a lot harder to do. That's why we tend to use forced choice items. Even though forced choice items also have a lot of cons to them, for example, they may not pick up some of the nuance of people's understanding of the concept. Also, they can also have problems that we call response sets, specifically acquiescence. You remember how I went in there and I just kind of clicked the button on things? Acquiescence is when people go in there and they just kind of like strongly agree with everything. It's acquiescent responding. They're always on one side of the response format. Or the other, it doesn't matter, but they tend to be the same. Strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree. That's acquiescent response set. Fence sitting is when instead they're like, oh gosh, I don't know, and they do neutral for everything. Oh, it's neutral, 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 and they do everything in the middle. They're like sitting on the fence. They won't go one way or the other. Those are problems because they don't pick up the variability and the difference that people might have on the different concepts. And if they don't do that, then we're not accurately measuring the construct that we want to measure. Okay, answer this. An interview is what kind of measurement? Is it self-report? Is it observation? Or is it none of the above? An interview is actually self-report. It's a self-report measure. The person isn't writing it down directly, but they are reporting what's going on in the construct, right? So if you sat down and interviewed me and say, how much do you love your wife? It's the same as if you gave me a piece of paper and a pencil and said, how much do you love your wife? The difference is it's out loud versus on paper. That's the only difference. I'm still self-reporting and saying, oh, I love my wife tons. That is the self-report that's going on. Which of the following does not apply to observational measures? Which one does not apply for observational measures? The answer is internal reliability. Internal reliability is the Cronbach's alpha stuff we were talking about. An observational measure doesn't have items, and so it can't look at the correlation between the items. It's not looking for the internal reliability. You can definitely do construct validity and content validity. You cannot do internal reliability with an observational measure. It doesn't make sense. It's only for self-report. Let's talk about observational measures since we mentioned those. So we talked about self-report. The other major category of measurements is the observational measure. This is when you go out there and you look and you watch people and you observe them. Well, one of the big issues with observational measures is the ethics that are involved. And I have kind of two things under here, legal versus ethical ethics. Do you remember when we talked about the bathroom study where people were watching to see how long it took men to urinate in a public bathroom? Let's talk about ethics in terms of legality versus ethicality, right? Legally, a public restroom is a public place. And so legally, it's actually legal to do that study. No one's going to arrest you. Now, does that make it really ethical? In psychology, what we consider to be ethical goes beyond what we consider to be legal. It has to be more than just legal. It has to have ethics, including the stuff that we talked about with the Belmont report, beneficence, justice, all that stuff. We've got to be able to know that people can withdraw, that they consent, etc. Now, with observational measures, sometimes we observe people in naturalistic settings where it's not an ethical consideration of watching them. So, for example, if you go and just go outside of any building on campus and watch people walking and how they talk, etc., that probably that's not unethical, right? You observe maybe how many times people touch each other as they're walking, right? That's not unethical. It certainly is legal. However, ethics need to go a little farther beyond. Let's say that the same people came up to you and said, hey, we think that you're watching us. Are you observing us? Ethically, as a good researcher, you should say yes. Not only should you say yes, you should say, this is exactly what I wrote about you, and show them. And you should also say, if you feel uncomfortable, I'm willing to destroy your data. And if they say, I want you to destroy my data, you actually destroy the data. Now notice how ethically that's differently than legally. You wouldn't have to do any of those things legally. If you're just watching people walk down the street, that's totally legal. And whether it creeps them out, that's up to them. But ethically, you want people to be comfortable with the research that's going on. And so ethically, you have those responsibilities that are different than the legal responsibilities. Okay. In observational measures, there's other things that we need to worry about. Remember how we worried about fence sitting and acquiescent responding and self-report surveys? Well, in observational measures, we have to worry about the observers and what's going to happen. So the first thing we need to worry about is observer bias. If I'm a researcher and I've got this study about, I think that, people who wear glasses are more likely to be in a relationship, and I'm going to do an all observational measure. So I go in and I observe people with glasses, and then I need to make a determination as to whether or not they're in a relationship. I might be biased because I want people who have glasses on to be more likely to be in a relationship. And so if I'm watching them, I might say, I think that touch over there, I think that indicates they're in a relationship. And that might be a different standard depending on whether or not I know that they have glasses on. So the person with glasses, they kind of brush against each other like that. Oh, yeah, they're definitely in a relationship. But somebody without glasses does that, like, I think they're like wiping off some dirt, but that's not in a relationship. my bias, it might not be intentional, but I might be biased in the way that I observe because I know what I want to see. Observer effects is that I, the observer, might affect the behavior. So if you can imagine me looking at people to determine whether or not they're in a relationship, they might actually notice me and they might act differently. They may say, oh, I think he wants to know whether we're in a relationship, so maybe we should act more like we're in a relationship, right? I, the observer, might make an effect on the people I'm observing. Reactivity is that when people feel like their control is being taken away, like they're under scrutiny, they react against that. They go against it. They have a different response. When people feel like their control is being taken away, like they feel like they should or have to act in a certain way, they often act reactant against that. This is what people call reverse psychology sometimes, right? You use reactivity to get the opposite of what you intend. But what's really going on is people are reacting against their feeling of their control being taken away, and they might act in an unnatural or even hostile way. These are things that are very problematic in observational measures. So what can you do? One thing that's really important, specifically to get away from the bias, is to get a code book, which we call a rating scale, which is, hey, this is exactly how we're going to rate this. So if I need to figure out if somebody is in a relationship or not, I would look for how many times do they hold hands? How many times do they touch each other, et cetera. These are the specific things that I would consider them being in a relationship. I make it very, very, very specific. And that's like a code book that we have for coding things even in a survey. You want to be very, very specific. These are the behaviors. This is exactly what we mean by touching someone, right? It has to be for, this amount of time. It can't be accidental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Having multiple observations. That means not just me observing, have multiple people observing. One way that that's important is, remember, we had inter-rater reliability, so we can test whether or not we're all rating things the same way. The other is to have a masked, or what's also called a blind design. In that case, the observer doesn't know what the hypothesis is. They just are measuring what they're supposed to measure. So a good one would not have the observers know that I'm trying to test whether or not people who have glasses have better relationships. Instead, they're just measuring, are they in a relationship or not? And then maybe somebody else might measure whether or not they're wearing glasses, okay? Or at least they wouldn't know what the hypothesis is. Also, use unobtrusive measures. That is, don't let them know that you're watching, right? Don't get it right in their face with a piece of paper and a pencil and stare at them. Try and be unobtrusive. Try and be natural. Try not to look unnatural. Just be natural in the place. Have patience. Be willing to watch and let people act the way they're going to act. Don't try and act all agitated, because that makes people feel like they need to act in a specific way. Look for the results of behaviors. Look for specific behaviors that you want, right? Whether it's touching, et cetera. Instead of saying, oh, how much do you feel like they're in love on a scale from 1 to 10? Oh, I think those people are in love an 8. Look for specific behaviors, because those are more objective. Okay, last question. Observational research. Does it use a sample? The answer is yes. And we haven't talked about sampling yet, but a sample is just the people who are in your study. That's what a sample is. And we'll talk more about sampling later on. The answer is absolutely. All of our research is going to use a sample, and we'll talk more about that later on. All right, thanks everybody.